Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on anti-gender politics and feminist struggles. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Gunnarsson. We are very excited about tonight's event. The topic will be neoliberalism, anti-gender politics, and feminist strategies. Our speakers are Gunnarsson, Payne, and Sofie Tornhill. Their talk tonight relies on their article, The Enemy is Enemy, Feminism at the Crossroads of Neoliberal Cooptation and Anti-Gender Conservatism. This article has been translated into Turkish and will soon be available in our latest edition, which we are also so excited to share with you very soon. Just to remind, this talk is being recorded and will be available online. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. You can type your questions on the chat box and I will try to read all of them if time permits. These seminar series are organized by the Journal of Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics with the support of rhetoric. We would like to thank them for their support in organizing these events. The event is in English, but there is Turkish translation available. Please select the language option by clicking on the globe icon. We would like to thank our translators Müge Atala and Barış Yıldırım. Our focus in the upcoming edition of our journal is anti-gender politics and feminist struggles. Since our first edition in 2006, our journal has explored feminist perspectives on persistent challenges related to militarism, war, nationalism, and economic and ecological crisis, and feminist activism. On a global scale, we find ourselves in a period of complex and intersectional crises that include military conflicts, environmental catastrophes, and challenges to democracy. The timing of today's gathering is important as we are in the midst of escalating violence in Israel and Palestine and an ongoing conflicts and wars in Ukraine, in Syria, and across the Middle East and North Africa. We hope our gathering today serves as a transnational feminist dialogue and an opportunity to learn from each other's experiences in order to develop feminist strategies to address some of these multiple crises. And turning back to event today, around the world, we have seen an increase in what is often called gender backlash or anti-gender movements. In many countries, the word gender is under attack and framed as an ideology. Along with the term gender, LGBTQ rights, gender studies, gender mainstreaming policies, and international agreements on women's equal rights and protection from violence are all facing increasing attacks. Turkey is also a case in point. Following the recent parliamentary and presidential election, attacks on women's and sexuality rights have become even more prominent. Today, building upon their article, The Enemy is Enemy, our speakers will discuss the challenges for feminist strategies in the context of neoliberalization of feminism on one hand and anti-gender politics on the other. Now, I'm so excited to introduce our speakers. Jenny Gunnarsson Payne is Professor of Ethnology at Södertörn University in Sweden. She has published widely on cultural and political aspects of gender, sexuality, and reproduction, including feminist mass movements and anti-gender mobilization. Sofie Tornhill is a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Studies at Linnaeus University in Sweden. Her research interests include sustainable development, corporate power, and feminist perspectives on international political economy. Dear Jenny and Sofie, we sincerely thank you again for accepting our invitation. The floor is now yours.
Okay. Yes, so we're obviously very honored to have been invited and for the article to be translated. And I think I want to thank the organizers and Isa especially for her wonderful introduction. I think she's absolutely right in the need for transnational feminist dialogues in times like these. Isa already introduced us very beautifully, but so my name is Jenny Gunnarsson Payne, and as you heard, I'm here with Sofie Tornhill. And just to give some background to this article, it started as kind of dialogue and a little bit of a side project because it's based on two different research strands, where Sofie for many years have been engaged in issues of gender, neoliberalism, and corporate power and related issues. And I have myself, since around 2015, taken an interest in so-called anti-gender politics, which initially emerged from being in close contact with Polish and Hungarian colleagues, where these kinds of ideas were widely spread before they emerged in Swedish politics on a more mainstream level. And I remember at that time, when I started to hear about it, it sounded on the one hand quite alien and different to what I was used to from the feminist context, but it also made me wonder whether, in fact, it could become more common in Swedish mainstream politics. And it has, and it's gone a lot quicker than I had expected, and we'll return to this later.
I'm also very excited to be here, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion after the presentation. I think it's going to be very interesting to engage in a dialogue with as many of you as possible. My entry into this collaboration that we've had around this issue, it really comes from this kind of like idea that the neoliberalization of feminism has been quite dominant for some time, at least a couple of decades, because for a long time, gender equality or women's empowerment was quite ignored in large-scale discussions on economic growth, global development, and so forth. And women were kind of sidestepped in many of these discussions. But at least like since the 70s, but it has been growing with the strength of neoliberalism, I would say. Certain feminist demands have become more normalized in these kind of like halls of power, so to speak. But they've also been instrumentalized. And that means that women's empowerment or gender equality is not necessarily seen as a goal in itself, but rather that it's something that can serve other interests, such as economic growth, for instance. And among the actors that have been strongly advocating this position is, for instance, a very strong actor such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. And according to them, it makes a lot of sense to invest in gender equality. They even talk about it as smart economics, meaning that if you invest in gender equality, it's not just going to be good for women or society at large, but it's also going to make a lot of economic sense. Because, for instance, you have like a larger pool of people to draw from when you're employing people, or it's a way of increasing women's work in the global south, for instance, that can then help cheapening production for many global corporations. And there's also this idea that women, in comparison to men, tend to invest more in social welfare, invest in education and the well-being of their families. So it's supposed also then to enhance development and better societies. And the UN also talk like in a similar way. For instance, they often return to this idea that women constitute the world's greatest untapped development resource. And it's estimated that if women were to participate fully in the labor market, and fully then means to the same extent as men do, that would actually increase the global national product by about 1/3. But then, of course, that doesn't take into account that women are not just sitting there doing nothing, but they actually work a lot. But a lot of that work is unpaid. So the question is then what happens to care? And many corporations, as this is something I've studied like how large-scale global corporations have launched programs in many countries in the global south, not the least, where they're investing in women's empowerment and investing in their entrepreneurship. And also tapping into this idea that it makes a lot of sense from a business perspective. They talk about it as a win-win relationship. That so by investing in women, they're going to increase their profits, but it's also going to give them a better reputation among consumers because they're investing in something that's kind of like a benevolent issue. And many corporations have also, at least in some parts of the world, used what is sometimes called femvertising. So in their advertisements, they are promoting pictures of strong women and girl power to sell their products, and to a certain extent also normalizing using kind of LGBTQ messages in their advertising.
Thank you. Yeah. But despite this despite this normalization, I was going to say partly normalization, but I realized that doesn't make sense in English. This gradual normalization of gender equality and LGBTQ rights also in corporate. Yeah, so even if it has been normalized in many parts of the world and even used to sell products and to promote economic value, it's still, of course, not an undisputed value, gender equality. But to fully understand the success of these anti-gender movements, we need to understand that this is not as new a movement as it appears in some corners of the world. I mean, some people, for instance, here in Sweden, has been surprised by its recent emergence. Yeah, but we need to understand that the anti-gender movements are not as new as they appear to some. And by new, I don't mean that misogyny or homophobia are new phenomena, obviously not, but the way that they formulate their messages and the way they organized is something that's been going on since the 1990s. And actually, an important background to understand here is that it started, the way that these movements narrate their anti-gender politics, it started quite clearly in the 1990s, and especially in the wake of two UN conferences, one in 1994 in Cairo on population, and the other one in 1995 on women. And what was specific at this time was that the term gender then increasingly made its way into rights discourse and into the UN documents. And for instance, the idea of gender mainstreaming was starting to win appeal in issues of governance at the time. And the critique, especially then by some Christian conservatives, especially Catholics, against this was that the word gender in itself was dangerous. And the reason it was dangerous was because it was seen as this sort of innocent sounding word, which was in actual fact a kind of Trojan horse, sort of appearing innocent, but in actual fact smuggling in radical ideas sort of through the back door. Yeah, the 90s was important. Gender was seen as this kind of Trojan horse by these anti-gender critics, seen as something dangerous. And it was actually this time where this kind of narrative that we recognize basically globally about gender as this dangerous, as ideological. They were not talking about gender ideology quite already at the 19, but instead the term the gender agenda was used and similar terms. But it was also seen as damaging, as a threat to families. And by that they mean, of course, or meant and still mean nuclear families, heterosexual families, and especially threat also to women and children, but also as a threat to kind of society at large, Western civilization, Christian civilization. So it was seen as a threat, not just I'm doing that to families, but also to something much bigger. So they saw a lot being at stake with gender being introduced in these documents and in the rights discourse. And an important part of this narrative that started to emerge at this time was also that gender was then formulated as this overarching enemy. And we can still see this in anti-gender rhetorics today, and hence the title of our article. And it's quite striking when you read the literature and the documents from this time, because it is so similar to what we hear today. It's basically, it's almost like a blueprint of much of what's being said in Europe, but also in Latin America and similar places. the Catholic groups were central to this mobilization, but then, of course, today we have a lot of evangelical and Orthodox Christian groups also as important actors. And they have been joined recently also by more secular actors. So you can change the slide now. I'm going to regain my focus here. And I wanted to show you this. I mean, it's quite boring sometimes to read quotes like this, but this is actually from Dale O'Leary's book, a very important book at the time. And she was very active in this mobilization, a US Catholic conservative writer and activist. And she said, the leaders of the coalition of groups promoting the gender agenda call themselves feminists, but advocacy of the gender agenda is not limited to women, nor to those major concern is feminism. Support for the gender agenda comes from activist groups, all somewhat interrelated or overlapping in interest, but nevertheless distinguishable. 1, population controllers. 2, sexual libertarians. 3, gay rights activists. 4, multiculturalists. 6, neo-Marxist progressive. 7, postmodernists and deconstructionists. The gender agenda is also supported by big government liberals and certain multinational corporations. And I marked this in yellow to show that this critique that they also have of corporate power was evident already in the 1990s. Another thing interesting in this is, of course, that you see that it's not only, within quotation marks again, a critique of women's rights activists or feminists, but they see this as a much broader agenda. And we can see this still today. So yes, can change slide now.
Okay, yes. So in this article, we talk about these two parallel tendencies as a kind of a double bind, where on the one hand, we have this phenomenon of very strong, powerful economic actors who embrace or commit to gender equality and women's empowerment. And some of these corporations, they have also been explicitly critiquing kind of anti-racist movements or homophobic movements or anti-feminist movements and made that into part of the way that they present their brand. So they want their brand to be associated with progressive values. But at the same time, these corporations continue to make profit out of women's cheap labor and often also migrants' cheap labor. So we have that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have this, what Jenny just talked about, like the emergence of right-wing conservative critique, which is often combined also with anti-migrant immigrant politics and critique. So these two really go together, and also critique against like anti-racism and other kind of like these like more progressive values. So what we ask in this article then is how feminist and queer politics might respond to this double bind. Like, so on the one hand, the tendency that some of their political demands are being depoliticized or de-radicalized in this kind of like corporate or neoliberal version. On the one hand, that, and on the other hand, this like very deep-seated hostility against feminist and queer issues. So that's kind of like the question that we ask in the article. So we can continue. Thank you.
Yes. And when I wrote this slide or like looked at it again, it's from a previous presentation that we have. I was wondering whether we should change the title of it because it says why on the rise now, because it has now been on the rise for a few years. But there is something interesting about the timing of when they gained momentum like they have today. So the question could be then why is it in the 2010s that this started to happen despite this long mobilization? And one answer is, of course, the long mobilization, because they had time to produce books, to build up their infrastructure, various NGOs, conferences. It's a very well organized kind of yet loose in the edges movement. But what happened in the 2010s, not least in Europe and the US, was this emergence of right-wing populism, but also a rise of authoritarian political actors on the political scene. And these anti-gender movements can be said to exist in this kind of happy marriage between these right-wing populist and authoritarian movements and leaders. And there might be several ways to explain this. I mean, one thing that fits very well between these movements is the promotion of traditional values, or so-called traditional values, and nationalism. If we look at how these movements frame these narratives, we can see that the traditional values tend to look rather similar in the different countries, and yet they are promoted as very unique to a specific nation. But they can also be seen to offer a kind of response to some problems that have been very clear since the 90s. So one thing that they offer is they can be seen as this reaction to a democratic deficit, which means that political decisions are increasingly made outside of democratic influence. So, for instance, the criticism of the UN is one example of a body which has a lot of influence globally through other types of governance. So in a sense, using the UN as part of this enemy picture is a way of formulating a critique against this democratic deficit. And this is true also for the critique of corporations that we have analyzed and we'll talk a bit about in a minute. Some explanations has also been that they can be seen as not a direct response to, but a way of channeling some frustrations among people against economic inequalities, not least after the financial crisis of 2008 and austerity politics following that. And what this political frustration has done is that it's paved the way for anti-establishment politics, like both in rhetoric, but also and with the appeal to common people, and using this idea of the underdog versus a corrupt elite, which right-wing populists have used to frame their nationalist politics. Also, it's been debated that it's a reaction against decades of post-politics, like some political theorists call it, which pretty much means that there has been a lack of clear alternatives, really, to both the left and the right, but that now the right-wing populists have been more successful in using in their mobilization. Now you can change slide. And this will be a little bit shorter. But some things in their rhetoric, which is quite interesting, I think, is that they also challenge both liberal democracy and neoliberalism. And they do so by claiming sovereignty of the nation and of family. And here again, you see this kind of perfect fit between right-wing populists and anti-gender movements. They also, in their own literature, criticize the sort of rampant individualism, which is connected to neoliberal culture. And they criticize Western neoliberal hegemony in different ways. I have read in much of the current literature this sort of critique of what they see as a lack of a deeper meaning in the neoliberal society. And even though we wrote in our article and still agree with that, I think that anti-gender movements or anti-gender politics is not incompatible with a capitalist world system. in many places they do combine some policies of very specific economic redistributions. So they combine it with the idea of traditional family values. It's very clear in Hungary, for instance, where benefits are paid to heterosexual families with many children. Based on these various critiques that they have, they challenge both liberal democracy and neoliberal hegemony on several fronts. And now you can change the slide.
Yeah, so what we then empirically study in our article is how these anti-gender movements use a critique of corporate power as a way to kind of underpin their anti-gender arguments. So we believe that the way that they criticize certain aspects of the economic system actually matters for the way that they try to frame their arguments as relevant and urgent and important. And what we have studied is a Canadian Catholic web portal called LifeSite. And this LifeSite, it was founded by a Canadian anti-abortion campaign in 1997. And it has, on its portal, it has news and it has blogs, it has podcasts, and also it hosts petitions for different kinds of political demands. And it has both a Canadian version, a US version, and a world version. But the largest audience of this web portal is in the US. So it's quite directed towards that audience. And in our article, we call it ultra-conservative, and it has been lobbying against abortion, against LGBTQ rights for many years now. And it's also connecting with other like-minded organizations. So it works as kind of like a spider in a web to a certain extent for these issues then. So by analyzing material, mostly like news items and blog entries on this website, we identify 4 different ways in which they pose a critique of corporations and corporate power as part of their anti-gender critique in its discourse, so to speak. So one way that they do this is that they are very critical against what they see as the emergence of a structure of global governance where global corporations and foundations and other kinds of institutions like the UN or the EU, other big NGOs, for instance, they have come to kind of like steer the international agenda and also to influence the agendas of many national countries as well, instead of democratically elected bodies. So they call this as kind of soft totalitarianism. And in the idea of them then, feminist and LGBTQ movements are supported by this global structure. So through foundations and so forth, the feminist and LGBTQ messages are being diffused on a global scale, according to them. So by arguing in this way, it's possible for them to see feminism and queer politics as part of this elite project, which is then totally undemocratic because no one can say like, no, we don't want this kind of politics. There's no way of voting it away. So it's something that's being imposed on everyone according to their way of reasoning then. So that's one way that they see it. Another critique that they have is of what can be called like their a critique against like the work ethic, which is also upheld by global corporations. And they see this as a very masculinist work ethic, which basically means that everybody should work as much as possible and are valued out of their according to how productive they are in the economic system. And this is then something that devalues care labor, the kind of labor that women have often conducted. So they see that forces both men and women to work and to prioritize work, and that this is something that is being cheered by feminists. So feminists and corporations both have an interest in as many women as possible working. And in as a parallel to this, or as a consequence of this, women's care labor is devalued, and there's also a need for women to use contraceptives and for abortions. So they see this as very linked, this like work ethic. And they also think that corporations uphold like a certain kind of ethic they're like functioning as gatekeepers. So for anyone who is against this like idea of LGBTQ rights or gender equality, they can basically be fired by corporations who mandate this kind of tolerance by the employees. So they also see that corporations steer kind of like what we're able to think, or that everybody needs to accept homosexuality if they want to have a job. So that's also part of their critique. And another aspect of this is that they're critical against this possibility that corporations have of mass communication through commercials and advertisements. And through this, they think that they are able to diffuse this gender ideology and to normalize homosexuality. In particular, they are critical against commercials that target the youth, so that they think that they're trying to steer young people away from traditional values, and that this is something that is being promoted by the so-called gay lobby. So the fourth way then or the fourth type of critique that we have identified is that they're critical of all corporations because of the reasons I just mentioned, but then they're particularly critical against some corporations who they think are specifically dependent upon the success of gender ideology, namely corporations that have as their business model or their business idea to control or to intervene in women's reproductive health. So, for instance, corporations that are somehow connected to contraceptives or to abortion, assisted reproduction, these are the kind of corporations that they're really, really focusing on their web portal. And according to them, this is also then something driven by corporate profit, but in tandem with a feminist ideology which masks this kind of like massive intervention into women's bodies as women's rights to choose. So they see how feminists are kind of fueling this as a way of free choice, but in actual fact, according to them, this is causing then a lot of suffering for women. So we can continue. And as you may have spotted here, there is actually some kind of convergences between feminist critique and anti-gender critique of corporate power, although they come to very different conclusions and also interpret why this is so in very different ways. But just like anti-gender critique, feminists have for long been very critical against the power of corporations and these structures of very undemocratic forms of governance. And they've also critiqued the fact that corporations have been taking a much more active part in issues such as gender equality, for instance, which has then changed the ways in which many organizations or states work with these issues. So this is something that has been a critique for a long time. And feminists also underline then that corporations continue to be dependent upon women's paid labor and also their unpaid labor. So they don't really see corporation as serving the interests of feminists, but rather that here what's going on is some kind of co-optation of feminists' demands and not the other way around, as anti-gender proponents think when they say, oh, that corporations are doing this because they are run by the feminist elite or they run the errands of the feminist elite. So it's like the mirror kind of interpretation here. And then there is, of course, also a very strong critique of the work ethic among feminist scholars and activists who have been very critical against the idea that everybody should focus mainly on production and that care is not given sufficient recognition, for instance, or that women's care labor is not counted as real labor, for instance. So this is also something that they've been arguing for a very long time, and there's been a lot of feminist mobilization around this issue of women's unpaid labor as well, and the importance of giving value to it. But for many feminists, they see it as a necessity to kind of to change the way in which we organize our productive and reproductive or caring lives and come up with alternative social orders that are centered around care instead of centered around economic growth. But in the anti-gender critique, it's more a critique of the fact that this ethic is imposed on women. It's not the ethic as such that there is something wrong with. So men can still continue with production and focusing on paid labor, while women are assigned this labor of unpaid care work. So for them, it's not necessary, and it's not even something that should be strived for. It's rather that the idea is rather to keep like the feminine and the masculine sphere as separate. And then in feminist circles and also in queer theory, this way that commercials and corporations sometimes post this like messages of women's empowerment or LGBTQ rights is often called pinkwashing. Oh, so something that doesn't really mean anything, that kind of pays lip service to these progressive ideas, but without really changing their practices in any significant ways. But as we saw for anti-gender movements, this is seen as a real threat against humanity, against civilization, against traditional values, against family. So for them, this is something really serious and important. And both feminist and anti-gender movements are critical against the medicalization of women's bodies and big pharma, so profits that are being made out of women's bodies in different ways. But for anti-gender movements, anti-abortion is like their prime target, and motherhood is seen as something that should be the big priority for women. Yeah. Thank you. We can continue.
Yes, and I will be quick because we're running out of time, or perhaps have run out of time, but I'll be quick with a couple of the final couple of slides because I think they're also interesting discussion points. But I mean, what we have tried to grapple with is how this kind of double bind offers challenges for progressive feminist politics. And one risk that happens and that we have identified in Sweden and elsewhere is that there is a risk because of these affinities that Sofie just talked talked about, for some unholy alliances to emerge. So, for instance, some gender-critical feminists may be in alliance with anti-gender movements or actors over some issues such as trans care or women's rights, and especially the trans care, I would say, is one such issue, not least in Sweden. Another challenge is that we believe that feminist politics really need to be able to speak to the many, to kind of challenge the idea that anti-gender movements are the representatives of ordinary people and common people, because instead we need to argue that ordinary people are also gay or in need of abortions, etc. And I think that we think that a strong feminist movement also need to challenge notions of the elite, and also don't be afraid of criticizing strong economic actors. And also point out that there are strong economic resources behind actually the anti-gender movements. So this double bind and this challenge entails issues such as how to elaborate a critique against one tendency without underpinning the other. So, for instance, how to value care labor, but show how the feminist version of this differs from anti-gender rhetoric. And likewise, to critique against anti-gender traditional family values, but without reinforcing the priority of paid labor over care. And you can change to the final slide. Yes, and this is more like an opening, we hope, for a discussion, because one thing, if you recall, you probably do, we've been talking about how this movement started mainly as a Christian movement, not least Catholic. But one thing that is, and we can see this in like the prototypical version, so in Hungary, Poland, and Brazil, for instance, where it's had a large influence. But I think that it would be very interesting to consider how both Turkey and Sweden are interesting cases for how they for understanding its adaptability. I know that our colleague Alev Özkasank has written on Turkey a very interesting piece. But also in Sweden, we have this issue that anti-gender actors has positioned themselves as an alternative to both what they call authoritarian gender relations, which is here associated in the mainstream media with Muslim immigration, and as an alternative at the same time to neoliberal individualism. So both cases are quite interesting, and I hope that we're going to be able to learn from each other in the discussion. Yes, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yes, so I hope it was possible to follow despite the little glitches.
Thank you both for this insightful presentation. Yeah, you were great despite these technical issues. And thank you again for urging us to think about some reflections on feminist strategies within these contexts of neoliberal claims of equality on one hand, and then these regressive attacks, conservative attacks on equal rights, on women's rights on the other side. And then we will now open the floor for questions. And please, everyone, type your questions in the chat box, and I will try to read them out for our speakers. And while waiting questions, to kick things off, I want to ask a question. I know this might require another session, but just to discuss a bit more about the issue. As you mentioned here, and also in your article, you pose a very significant question of how can we understand this anti-gender politicization that currently winning ground, but rather than feminist imaginations or feminist thoughts. And here, what happened or what went wrong in terms of these decades of national and transnational gender equality, mainstreaming policies and anti-discrimination politics, that despite some efforts, we are now fear that it's anti-gender politics that finds a platform to thrive, but not feminist ones. Would you like to elaborate more on this?
Yes, we can try.
Yeah, we'll try.
We had the answer.
I know
Yeah.
this is another session. So.
Yeah, no, but it's like, I mean, sometimes you hear the argument that it's kind of like the failure of feminism, that feminism hasn't managed to make itself relevant to as many people as enough people, in a way that feminism has kind of like diverted from real political issues and more been interested in cultural issues, for instance, or issues of representation, intersectionality, and that it kind of like strived away in the wrong direction. And I don't think that's true, because I think there has been a lot of progressive feminist critique in many, many circles. And in many parts of the world, but it's more the case that it hasn't really been heard or taken up. And one thing that we say in the article, and I think might have to do with it, is that so it's very difficult for this critique to be taken into account or to be taken seriously. To like the radical feminist critique to be taken seriously without changing the economic system. So the kind of feminism that has been mainstreamed is the kind that doesn't really disturb economic power relations, for instance, that can be added on to existing political projects, but without fundamentally shaking them up and doing something very different. But this anti-gender critique, it seems that kind of like resonates with some political demands that people have, but they don't have to grapple with this kind of like, okay, we need a new economic system, because it's just like what they want is to restore traditional family values, and that this is the sphere where people can have their freedom, not necessarily as workers or in the way that economic resources are being distributed, but they can have their freedom in their families. And so it's more of kind of like the answer is then to restore traditional genders, basically, like traditional views of masculinity and femininity, and that is solving problems. Do you want to continue, Jenny? Because
you put it so eloquently, so I'm glad that you started. I mean, I think it's very important that you pointed out that it's that we shouldn't call it like a failure of feminism in one way, but then on the other hand, I mean, to oppose myself a little bit, it's like a failure of some versions of feminism. Certainly, I mean the kind of post-feminist idea that everyone is already free and can do what they want. This kind of empowerment feminism, which doesn't have so much substance to it. I mean, that could be seen as a failure of that kind of feminism. In the Swedish system, I think certainly a failure of state gender equality policy, which doesn't really take into account, let's say, in terms of childcare and those kind of issues, the current gender equality policy would mainly benefit middle class and high income women and forget about those working in low wage professions and which cannot work flexibly from home or things like that. So yes, I agree with Sofie, not a failure of feminism per se, and especially not, we shouldn't fall into that, but it is a failure of certain, I don't know, adaptations of feminism or versions of feminism.
But perhaps that it has also been regarded, both in like Sweden, for instance, as a non-political issue, as something that everybody can agree on and nobody can be against. And that, I think, is very far from the truth, because we see now how a lot of people are actually against this and have been probably all along. But it's being mobilized as something that people can actually kind of come together around.
Yeah, and we see a lot similar rhetorics to previous sort of surges of racism, that it's now posed as, yes, we have to talk about this issue, like everyone's thinking it, but no one's really talking about it. So it's a very similar rhetorics to some sort of nationalist racist ideas that emerged more in the mainstream, like a few years ago.
Yeah,
Thank you. I can now see two questions on our chat box, and the first one from Bengi Cengiz. I will now read it out for you. Thanks a lot for a great presentation and article. My question concerns Sweden. The current government coalition has declared a change in aid policy and is moving away from the principles of feminist foreign policy. How do you think such political and institutional shifts relate to the rise of anti-gender movement in Sweden?
Very much so. Sofie is the one with a background in political science, so perhaps you'd like to elaborate first. But I think it's intrinsically tied to that, isn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely. And then the Swedish kind of like feminist foreign policy was implemented by the previous social democratic government. And during that time, I must say, there was also a lot of critique against it, because on the one hand, it said, yeah, we have a feminist foreign policy, but on the other hand, we're closing the borders for migrants fleeing from war, and Sweden being also not necessarily selling weapons to countries that should perhaps not buy weapons and so forth. So there were a lot of question marks around this, like how feminist was actually the foreign policy. But that set aside, it's by the current government, which is a right-wing government that relies upon the support by a nationalist, racist party, which has its roots in the neo-Nazi movement in the 80s. And they are now the second biggest party or third biggest party in Sweden. And for them, this is something that is really, really not acceptable, that there would be a feminist foreign policy. But also, I think the rest of the right-wing government, it's like, no, it's to them, this is like an example of social democratic kind of like signposting that doesn't mean anything. It's like a symbolic thing. And to them, they don't see any value in connecting their politics to feminism, as the social democratic government obviously did. So for them, feminism doesn't signal a positive value necessarily. Although some of them call themselves feminists, but they would not go in this direction.
Yeah, no, thank you. I agree.
Yeah. Thank you. There is another question about feminist strategies, and Ayten Sönmez is asking, telling that you argue that the feminist movement has to produce alternatives to the answers offered by both neoliberalism and anti-gender movements. Where should we start looking for alternative answers to these two sides, or what are the starting points from which we can develop feminist strategies?
So can I start on that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
No, it also relates, I think, to another question that came into the other chat. But I think that's a very good question. And I'm glad that it was posed, because, not that me and Sofie should sit here and say that, oh, this is a solution, but we mustn't forget that there are some current feminist mobilizing going on globally that is very inspiring, and that has managed to actually produce this kind of feminism for the people. The struggles of Poland, for instance, the Black protests that started as a struggle against the abortion ban. That was like this kind of feminine or this kind of mobilizing where people really went into the street and also managed to mobilize people who hadn't been politically engaged before. It was a kind of political awakening. And at the same time, what happened in Argentina as the sort of starting point for this Latin American green wave when they had their first neo-Namenos protest against femicide, and that then also emerged into the abortion struggle. But both of these movements and also other around the world has managed to do precisely this, that they have, I mean, they might have seen initially like a one-issue movement, but then they have integrated more and more political demands in their struggles. And those demands also include things like me and Sofie were talking about, economic demands, but also things like demands for a secular state and concerning issues that are much, much broader than sort of what we narrowly might think of as women's issues. So I think there are definitely, I mean, that's the kind of movements that I think we should turn to. And I know that you also have in Turkey, I don't know to what extent now, I haven't followed it so much recently, but there's been a very vivid and strong feminist movement in Turkey, or have I got that wrong? That's my impression, at least. So that's there are movements to do that. I think one interesting issue is also, and it's actually a study going on by a PhD student that I'm supervising now, and she's looking into how feminists in Poland who were previously or have been engaged in the civil society mobilization in these protests, and how they are turning into party politics and trying to make a change through that. The study isn't finished, and there's a new election very shortly coming up in Poland. So we don't know where that will end, but I think it's an interesting development to follow and see what they manage to do. There are probably more things to say, but do you want to fill in, Sofie?
Yeah, I just saw in the chat that there was this question about, and I totally agree with the need for very strong kind of movements and organization, feminist organization. But if we see any spaces of hope in Sweden, and I mean, it's difficult to talk about it's kind of like, okay, so what's the main explanation for this? But I would say, I mean, I wouldn't say that there aren't any feminist movements in Sweden or that there aren't groups mobilizing, but it's not very visible. We don't see any large, like 8th of March demonstrations. There has been much more so in the past, I would say. And maybe, I mean, there like one reason for this could be this kind of like like the way that feminism has to a certain extent been institutionalized into the state structure in Sweden, so that has kind of like apparently decreased the need for a strong civil society movement, which is of course very problematic when that political will is shifting. So, I mean, you can't really count on that political will always being something supportive and stable. And that's something that we also see with this kind of like the pseudo or like the proto-feminist kind of like embracement of feminist ideas by corporate actors. There's nothing that kind of like guarantees that these are going to be continuing with their like endorsement of gender equality and women's empowerment. I mean, if political winds are shifting, they might as well start promoting traditional family values. That's also a possibility.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis on Sweden. I think it's, I mean, there are quite many still identifying as feminists, even though it's not as sort of mainstream as it used to be. But also one tendency in Sweden is also that there are some splits between different feminist groups, which also makes it a bit more difficult to mobilize broadly. And I think the issue of transgender rights is a very important one. I had planned to expand a little bit on that before as well, because I mentioned these kind of unholy alliances. between like anti-gender actors and gender critical feminists. And I think in Sweden it's been very clear that that's happened. I mean, you can clearly see how it happens because some gender critical feminists, being sort of critical on trans care, have been platformed or deplatformed, sorry, from sort of other feminist venues or arenas, and that's but instead been invited by conservative anti-gender actors, debaters to talk about their ideas. And I think this is highly troubling, and I don't really know the solution to it because obviously I stand for transgender rights, so that's not what I'm questioning here. But I think this kind of split, that these discussions cannot be held sort of within the framework of the feminist movement is very unfortunate, and that there should perhaps, I would have loved to see other ways of taking these discussions or dealing with these discussions.
Thank you. And I can now see two more questions and some comments on chat box. The first one is in Turkish, so I will read it out and hopefully you will hear the translation. It's from Özlem Erikçi. Merhabalar. Öncelikle emeklerinize sağlık.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your effort. It was a very nice presentation. Additional to all this discrimination, there's a big bind in Turkey, Islam, actually. This understanding is becoming an argument for masculinist power, keeping women in domestic areas. Even when they're on the streets in the bazaar, women are being marginalized, they're being othered, and there is a reflection of it in all classes. But in countries like Turkey, where there's big class differences, there are difficulties, especially on the level of middle classes in terms of the struggle, but still the biggest opposition is the feminist movement. Even though the examples are similar sociologically, I guess there is no such deep separation in terms of faith or religion. Is there any such examples now or in history where faith and religion is making all kinds of struggles in a disadvantaged position? Could you give any examples, if not the Swedish society?
I'm trying to understand the final part of the question.
I guess it's more about the power, the authority of religion and belief in this context.
Yes, I mean it's in the Swedish context. One thing which is interesting, and also that even I didn't really see coming, is actually that conservative Christians have mobilized also here. So I mean, we talked about the kind of international picture, but we also see more and more Christian anti-gender actors being active in the debate. And because Sweden for such a long time has been so secularized and had such a clear separation between church and state, of course not historically, but it's still been a very strong tendency. And also there's been quite a strong consensus about this until, or still is. But now these voices are becoming more heard, and they're often more explicit as religious voices, even if I think in international comparison, there's still quite secularized rhetorics around this. I don't know if this relates to the question either, but I think I mentioned it in the presentation that here it's also interesting to see which kind of anti-gender rhetoric is used and kind of adapted to the Swedish situation. So even though the Christian actors are becoming more loud, we have not yet seen the idea of traditional values so strongly here. And I think an explanation for that is because of the Swedish self-identity as secular, as modern. So traditional values aren't really kind of sellable in a kind of political way. It doesn't really speak to so many. And also the tendency to pose among these Christians to pose their way as the kind of reasonable, not traditional, but still gender binary and biologically scientific way of organizing society. And then this is against the neoliberal, what they would call radical feminist version, but also against the idea of the sort of Muslim other, that is allegedly those who are authoritarian, those who are really traditional in that sense. So it's interesting how they carve a space as for themselves as some kind of in-between version between that. I don't think that answered the question precisely. Have you got any reflections, Sofie?
No, but just one small reflection that it's that these Christian groups that you talk about tend to be quite, small Christian groups.
Yeah.
So like the Swedish state church, or so to say, like the main church has been quite progressive on these issues. In terms of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and so forth, during the last couple of decades, obviously, not for
not historically,
but now for the time being, and also like speaking out strongly against anti-racism or against racism, against anti-immigration stance, and so forth. So that's
that's very good. I mean, sometimes because I read all these really conservative literature, I kind of forget about things around that. But that's a very, very good point, actually, about the Swedish church. And it has also been, the Swedish church has been very welcoming also to non-believers. It's actually part of their policy to welcome everyone and to not be like judgmental. And that everyone is welcome in the church. So that's a very stark contrast to some other ways of organizing religion. And I think that's actually I didn't grow up with a church close to me in that sense, but because I grew up in a very secular family. So I didn't think I would say that, but actually the Swedish church and those kind of progressive Christians are very important at this point, I think, in the Swedish conjuncture.
Yeah, I think what makes Turkey different in this context is exactly this institutionalized Islam religion from top-down policies to the bottom up on every issues. Islam, the religion is at the heart of every issues in Turkey politics, from education to women's rights and to family care, economic policies. We see this strong ideas and perspectives. So that's why Turkey maybe differs a bit from those examples from Europe.
Yeah, but if we look at like Poland, for instance, which I know a little bit, there the church and the state are very closely connected, and they're very allied. And I think their status there is very much tied to the fall of the Soviet Union, and that the Catholic Church there was an important force in order to make that happen. So they have a very strong status there. I think Sweden is, if you look at these kind of world value maps about secularization, it's like a standard here to show that, then Sweden is very extreme with regards to its secularization. And many people never attend church, perhaps using it for weddings or christenings, or not even that, but it's very secularized in international comparison. So perhaps that's why it's hard to respond to this question. But I think religion is an important part of it, and I think it's going to become more important here as well.
And it's already important in the way that it's interplaying with this kind of like, on the one hand, anti-gender, on the other hand, anti-migration, which taps in a lot into this like ideas of like who is having traditional values, who is a threat against LGBTQ rights, who is a threat against women's rights, which is something where this very kind of nationalist party is constantly kind of swaying back and forth. Like on the one hand, they're like, oh yeah, we're for tolerance of LGBTQ people, and the threats are coming from the outside. That's the immigrants who are like threatening LGBTQ communities. And on the other hand, they are connecting, like the last Pride parade, they were talking about in terms of like promoting pedophilia, in terms of being harmful to children. So it's like they have not really taken a position on this, but they're using like notions of religion and intolerance as sometimes a resource in their critique, and sometimes they are themselves.
I think there are also internal conflicts and debates about
definitely
issues there. But I also agree. I mean, they're kind of treading this tightrope between whether they should be like femo-nationalist, homo-nationalist, or anti-gender. And it's definitely shifted much more towards anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. It has not been as accepted to say it in public before, as it's as it's becoming now, I would say.
Thank you. Actually, we are coming towards the end of our session, but I see 2 more questions and comments, so I want to read them out. The first one is about the immigration policies, migration policies that maybe you actually mentioned a bit about. This is an opportunity to discuss more. Thank you for your presentation. If gender is one of the most important items in European countries' politics, migration will be another. I would appreciate if you could reflect on the relation between anti-migration and anti-gender in Europe. On the one hand, anti-genderists are concerned about the demography and therefore very anti-migrant. But on the other, some communities are also supporting anti-gender agenda and therefore can be natural allies, maybe even enemy's enemy. What do you think of this tension?
Yeah, very nicely put. I appreciated that. Where to start? I mean, definitely they are the 2 like major issues. I mean, of course, we have wars going on and things like that, but I think also like the 2 key aspect in European politics now, and Swedish politics specifically. And I think this, and because they are also key issues in the kind of division within the EU as well, and the struggle about what the EU should be. I mean, the anti-immigration policy, or like the keeping immigrants outside of the EU border, that's been there for a long time, but it's certainly tightening. But then we also have these different blocks in the EU that it's challenging some more of the more liberal ideas within the EU, for instance, with regards to gender. So Poland and Hungary are big players there, for example, but also more countries being potential allies in that struggle. Do you have any reflections, Sofie? I feel like
I mean, it's like just like to give it a very, very recent example from Sweden, the way that these things are connected, because the current government is extremely critical against migration. They really want to like keep it at 0, and arguing that Sweden has actually been allowing too many immigrants, and that has like cost, according to them, like it's really the reason for all the problems that they see in current society in Sweden, which are many problems, but they're also connected to the kind of neoliberal politics that have been cutting taxes and under investing in welfare for many years now. But so they have this like very strong argument that there is a current wave of gang violence in Sweden that has been horrendous, and it's continuously horrendous. But that is being like explicitly blamed on immigrants by our current government, and the Social Democrats don't really protest against this image, which I think is really, really problematic, because they talk about this as an imported problem. So it has nothing, according to them, to do with Swedish society as it is. But in this, so on the one hand, it's a problem of migration, but on the other hand, they also see it as a problem of gender equality politics and sort of kind of like gender relations being shifted. So, I mean, some of these debaters are talking about it in this way. So the problem, as they see it, is that, okay, so men in Sweden are no longer kind of like taught to be men in a good way, because we have this distorted way of thinking about gender relations as constructed and so forth. So they are not allowed to be real men. And these young men that end up engaging in criminal activities and gang violence only meet women in the very feminized kind of like structure of society as teachers or as social workers and so forth. And these women, according to them, have no means to handle these men. So it's interesting to see how it's blamed on the one hand on migrants and on the other hand on women and women's participation on the labor market. But then, of course, it's also seen as a problem of these immigrants' families as problems because of their gender relations as well. So it's a complex kind of...
Yes, on the one hand, there's sort of idea of the extremely authoritarian family, which in this context is associated with migrants, and especially Muslim migrants. And on the other hand, this feminization of Swedish society. But I have to add, I mean, it's great that you brought that example up. We were discussing it before, weren't we? So I'm glad that you remember that. But this is a rather new and it's not been discussed in mainstream media yet, but it's been discussed in more sort of narrow channels of the Sweden Democrats. But I can see it coming and becoming more visible. This idea that it's the fault of women. Women are too weak and cannot tell the voice off properly and things like that. And the reason I was kind of laughing or smiling is because I listened to this man, a very prominent man within the Sweden Democrats circles, who were talking about this the other day, and I could hardly believe my ears, even if I should see it coming, because it's like, okay, yes, so of course it's the women, it's the mother's fault. It felt like, a little bit expected, but also a bit surreal at the same time.
But as an answer to this question, I think at the moment still, this very strong anti-migrant politics is still stronger than kind of like anti-gender politics in Sweden, I would say. So I don't see really that there is this like development of natural allies now among like with migrant communities. These connections are not being made. It's more a question of keeping migrants out, closing borders. That's kind of like their political priority at the moment, I would say.
Yeah, it's like...
I think this is also, So I think this is also the case for all around Europe right now.
Definitely,
including UK.
Yes, very much so. I wish we could talk for ages about this, because it's. I mean, we also now we wrote a project application on partly this topic of LGBTQ migrants, and it's a very complex situation for people coming here for asylum for that reason.
I see two more questions. Actually, they are related, and they are directing us to the title of our presentation about feminist strategies. Let me read the first one. Thank you so much. However, increasing popular feminism, for example, the World Economic Forum predicts it will take 131 years to reach gender parity. The Sustainable Development Goals report for 2023 is even bleaker. It predicts that women are currently 140 years away from achieving equal representation of women in positions of power and leadership in the workplace. It will take us 286 years to eliminate discriminatory laws against women, 47 years to attain equal representation in parliamentary positions, and a staggering 300 years to end child marriage. The role of authoritarian right and conservative regimes in these issues is obvious. So what is the leftist attitude, actions, or concrete steps on this issue? Or what are the policies of leftist governments in Europe on this anti-gender movement? Can you give some examples? And the next question, a bit related with this, asking about feminist strategies on these issues. Another question that requires a huge question.
But it's a very good and huge question. And also, I mean, I was starting when I listened to it to try and kind of disentangle it and say, okay, so what is the left-wing government, for instance? It's not necessarily, I mean, even the Social Democrats here, I wouldn't really position as left today. So that's one question. And in Europe, of course, there are many different countries, and I don't know all the details there. Do you have a better answer, Sofie, on this issue? I mean, because you work with development issues as well, perhaps you have something to say about it. I feel it feels a bit too far away from my expertise.
But I think, I mean, for instance, there are many feminist organizations. I mean, returning to this issue of corporate power, for instance, I mean, there are feminist organizations that are working, for instance, to implement a tax on corporations, like a mandatory tax. If they say like, oh, we are so much for women's empowerment, so but still they're trying to avoid taxes as much as possible. So one example would be to promote that kind of politics. Another very concrete political option that has been favored by some political parties, but at the moment, and I know that there have been some workplaces in Sweden, some in Finland, also in France, I think, is shortening working hours. So instead of working 8 hours, work, say, 30 hours or less, but keep the salary. So that would also be one way of shifting this, like always prioritizing production instead of prioritizing care work, for instance. So tax the rich and work less. I mean, I think that's two good feminist strategies, but they would of course not solve everything, because we also have a very, very unequal distribution of resources, which I think the current climate catastrophe is only intensifying. And of course, many of these questions of like women's rights when concerning like child labor or discriminatory laws or child marriage, for instance. I mean, these are like issues that really, really need to be worked on by, but also including, I think, feminist organizations in countries where these practices are very common. And I know that we haven't really been so concrete about like the feminist strategies that we have at hand, but I think one strategy that is perhaps not a strategy, but it's this idea of not kind of like counting on these like friends in quotation marks, that I mean, not counting on like so institutionalized politics as we might have done in Sweden a little bit too much, but also not putting our hopes too much. I mean, it can be comforting, of course, when you see all of this kind of like hostile politics amounting, and you have a strong big global corporations like Coca-Cola coming out and saying, oh, we are for LGBTQ rights. I mean, that's something that you can be happy about to a certain extent. But on the other hand, I think that's a very kind of volative, well, it's not a very stable support that we can count on, I think.
No,
because it can be turned around.
Exactly.
So I mean, one strategy would be to kind of like you were saying, Jenny, like this kind of like really, if they are saying like, okay, so these are elite interests, to really point to that, but these other, like these anti-gender groups, they are elite interests. They have lots of economic funding, for instance. They're very strong actors. So to kind of like, I don't know, amount a critique against all kinds of kind of like economic strongholds, including these kind of anti-gender movements, which are also extremely networked and global and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the feminism of the people is like an ideal for me to think in terms of course, we wouldn't be the only ones to say that. I think also like this idea of the feminism for the 99% is a very clear example of how to think feminism in the current situation, and which I think actually also is the kind of feminism which can get support for women and others who might not necessarily identify as feminists at the moment. You need to speak also to issues that are relevant to people who are relevant to the working classes too. And I think perhaps that's been a little bit of a failure of much Swedish feminism in the recent decades, that those some important issues have been forgotten. So that would be, it's not very concrete answer, but a feminism of the people.
Exactly, yeah. I think we are now time to say goodbye, and I can't see any more questions on chat. And yeah, thank you again for sharing your work with us and your insights. And yeah, I think this is the starting point to discuss more about these strategies. We can find them just one session, I guess. And I hope we can continue on other gatherings. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight and by contributing with your questions and comments. And also many thanks to our translators, Müge Atala and Barış Yıldırım, for their support. Our third and final webinar of this year will be in November, and we will keep discussing feminist activism in the context of Poland. And we will share details of this event later on our social media, and we look forward to seeing all you there in the next meeting. Before we go, I would like to thank again Pınar Ecevitoğlu and for this support organizing this event. And yeah, thank you very much. Would you like to add some final remarks before you say goodbye?
Just many thanks again to both the organizers, the translators, and everyone that was attending this evening. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.